Hi, I'm Jinny Byer, and I want to welcome you to the 2018 Block of the Month Mystery Quilt, Kyoto Mystery. This month is the very first clue in the quilt, and you will be downloading the information from the newsletter. We're going to talk about the fabrics first. We've put together 4 kits, 4 different colorways. The one I will be demonstrating with today and throughout the 8 lessons is the teal version, but we also have the red-green, the blue, purple, and the mauve. So there's 4 color combinations. Now some of you, I know last year a lot of you did your own fabrics, and that was a lot of fun too. And I wanted to give you just a little bit of guideline if that's what you're going to do this year. You will find in your downloading material that you're going to have this month the color chart. It's 4 different colorways of the 4 kits that we've included. Now I refer this to you mainly so that you can see the order of the fabrics, because shading fabrics from light to dark is really important in this particular quilt, and if you have any strong jumps from one color to the next, that will be a problem. Altogether there are 12 fabrics. One of those is the border print and one of them is the binding. So mainly you're working with the fabrics that we'll be using for the most part. So let's say, for instance, that you decided you wanted to use this Casablanca border for your quilt instead of the Miyako border that we've used. The border print is very specific to this quilt, and it makes it's part of what enhances the quality of the quilt. So I really urge you, even if you've never worked with a border print before, we're going to be going through all the different steps that you need to figure out how in these video lessons. So in the quilt, the narrow border, the wide border, it doesn't really matter that much how wide it is or how narrow, but the narrow border, you want to be able to have some place in there where you can have 2 inches, because there's a spot in the quilt where you need to fit that within there. But with this border, you can, you could go from, you don't have to use the whole entire thing. You could go from one edge to another. These edges, depending on what fits the template the best, you may cut off one of these little stripes in there somehow. But ideally, if you had a border that is 2 inches across, that would work. Then for your 10 shaded fabrics, you're going to go light to dark. So a really good tool to use is my portable palette. It's got all 150 colors of my palette fabric collection, and the colors pretty much span the color spectrum. So you can usually develop a color palette from this tool and then go to your stash or go to the quilt shop to find other fabrics in those similar colors. You can either use these palette fabrics or you can find other colors that fit that range. But for this quilt, you don't want any super high contrast prints. You want to have kind of tone on tone, because there is a shaded quality that you want to affect. It shades from light to dark or dark to light, whichever way you want to talk about it. But one of the things I like to do is kind of find colors that would be in the range of this. So you can spread the palette out and you can decide, okay, I like those colors, I don't like them, maybe this one is jumping out a little bit. Maybe I don't want golds that are quite that gold. So I can go to another part of the palette and bring in sort of the tannish golds as well. You kind of pick up some of those brownish tones, get rid of the brighter yellows and shade into these. And then I'll probably pull out a couple more lighter ones. And then I can just count until I get, you've got several here that are very, very similar to each other, so I could get rid of some of those. Now I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So there's 10 colors that kind of go with that border print. And you just play around with it until you get a shading of 10 colors that goes from light to dark. Or make it simple on yourself and get one of our kits. 4 colorways are very distinct, so maybe one of those suits your fancy, or just go to your stash and use what you have. But have fun selecting your colors, and then we'll talk more about how you're going to work with them in a minute. So once you've got your fabric selected that you're going to use for the quilt, we'll get ready to start clue 1. What we are going to be covering here is making your templates, because this particular lesson is template based. We're going to talk about these odd angles on the pieces we're going to be sewing and how matching the dots and how you get the dots on it. We're going to be talking about straight line sewing. I will be demonstrating by hand, but you're welcome to do this quilt by hand, by machine, however you want to do it, glue it. No, but it would be easy, wouldn't it? Anyway, the first thing is that your downloaded materials for this month, there'll be a lot that you download. There will be 4 pages of templates that we will be using throughout the project. And you know, it's nice to be able to rotary cut everything, but if you get patterns that are really more interesting than just rectangles and squares, you do have odd sizes that don't easily fit to rotary cutting techniques. We will be doing some rotary cutting for some of the pieces, but this lesson this time is template based. So there are 4 pages of templates in your materials that you download, and what we have done, and a lot of people took advantage of it last year, it makes it a lot easier. We have printed those templates on template film that we've developed ourselves. They're heat resistant, so we can photocopy directly onto the film. You can purchase the blank film pages from us, or you can also purchase them already pre-printed onto the film, the templates. That's the easiest way. Otherwise, you will have to take the pattern to make your templates. You'll have a blank piece of template film or template plastic if you have some of your own at home. You will place it directly over the whichever template it is that you're going to need, and draw around the template and cut it out. You want to transfer all the markings so you know where the grain line is, if there's any mirror lines, and so forth. So I find it's a lot easier just to print them out on the template film, and either on your own printer or purchase them already pre-printed from us. I want to caution you, if you are using the Jinny Buyer template film, do not run it through your inkjet printer. It only works on a laser printer, so that's the most important thing. The inkjet printer will just smear the ink all over. So the other very important thing on all of the pages of templates, well, I mean, on the first page of the template, you're going to see this little box. And what that box is, it's a gauge for you. You know, not all printers print the same. Some of them print to page, some of them scale it a little bit up or down. So before you print onto the template film, if you're going to purchase the blank film, before you print onto that, I would print it out on a piece of paper first, because you don't want to waste the film if it's the wrong size. So print it out on a piece of paper, measure this little box, and if that box is 2 inches, then you know it's the right size gauge for you for the patterns. If the patterns are off a little bit, it's not going to fit together for the quilt. So that's the most important thing when you're working, that your printer, that you printed these instructions out at home, is to scale. And if it's not, you go to the page setup, if it's too small, you increase to 101%, maybe 102. You just keep trying, printing it out on paper before you finally get the perfect gauge, and then you can print it out on your printer onto the template film. So in this particular clue, you're going to need 2 fabrics. You're going to need fabrics 8 and 9, which are the 2 lightest fabrics in my kit right here. So these are the 2 fabrics that I need. And you're going to need templates E and F. So you'll either make those, as I mentioned a moment ago, or you'll have them on pre-printed film. Now those are really large templates, so we couldn't fit them all on one piece of film, and you wouldn't either printing them out. So we've given them in 2 sections, and they have a little line across here. So I've got one of them already cut out. And what you do is, so you got the 2 pieces that this template is into, and you saw that little dotted line, and you can just butt those dotted lines and make sure you got both of them right side up. You butt those dotted lines right next to each other. Put a piece of tape, turn it over to the reverse side and put a piece of tape on the reverse. And you'll do the same with template F. Just cut it out right on the line. Now I want you to notice as I'm cutting this, you have these dots. Those dots indicate where you line this fabric once you cut the pieces up to the adjacent fabric. You'll see those angles are really odd angles. So here again, make sure you've got both sides up. We will be using these two templates for this month's clue. Here again, I'm going to butt up those two edges and put a piece of Scotch tape down. Then I'm going to flip it over, put a piece of tape on the other side, and I've got the two templates ready for cutting out of the fabric. So we're using templates ER/ER and F/FR. Now what that actually means is that for the FFR, that means the F is right side up, the R is the reverse, which means it's the mirror image of it. I find the easiest way to cut mirror image pieces like this is to cut two at a time. So for instance, if you have the fabric, I would press this nicely, and you have it all laid out. You can, because it's already folded, it's together, you've got wrong sides of the fabric together. So if I put this down here and trace around it, I'm automatically going to get a reverse and a regular. So you don't have to be cutting one at a time. I find when you're working with templates, you get a cleaner cut if you're cutting two at a time. I wouldn't cut more than two at a time. So following the instructions on your pattern, because it's different for each kit, which fabric you use may be slightly different. So you want to follow the instructions, and you're going to cut from this fabric 8 and fabric 9, you'll cut 6 and 6 reverse from one, using one of the templates, 6 and 6 reverse from the other. The lightest color will be cut from template FFR. That's the longer of the two. And the other color will have you cut pieces E and ER. Now you would just follow the grain line on the template. Now by grain line, you see the arrow, there's always and that talks about the grain line. I usually like to think of that grain line as a straight of grain. Wherever possible, I'll put it on the straight of the fabric. And if you don't know what I mean by that, let me explain. When you buy a fabric by the yard, such as this piece, you've got the two selvage edges. When you unfold it, you have on either end, you have a selvage. When you stretch along the selvage, that's considered the straight grain, and it's as straight as the fabric is going to be. There's also a cross grain going the opposite way at right angles to that, and you'll notice when I pull that, it's a little bit of a pull, stretch there. So the arrow indicates wherever possible to put it on the straight grain. That's not always possible if you want to conserve some of the fabric, but you definitely don't want to put it on the bias. The bias is the diagonal across the fabric, and that really stretches. You can see how that really stretches. So you would just place that. Now it's important because one of these fabrics will be used in a later clue. So you want to follow, depending on your kit, the instructions and the guidelines for cutting in the pieces that you download. And you will reserve the portion that's needed for the later clue. So template FFR is going to go along the straight grain of the fabric, which is the up and down that runs along the selvage. The cross grain would be going this way. Now I think your pattern diagram has you cutting a couple of those pieces, depending on which color kit you have, has you cutting a couple of those pieces from the straight grain, because you need to conserve a big chunk of this to use for a later clue. Now, my favorite tool for marking around these templates is the Clover Tailor's chalk. It comes in 4 colors. I have here a blue because it's going to show up on the light colored fabric. It comes in blue, red, those are the 2 darker colors, and yellow and white. So I always like to have on hand a light one and a dark one. The yellow won't show up as well on this fabric, so that's why I'm using the blue. And you just hold the template down, and you'll find our template film, if you've used our template film, it has a grip to film so that it kind of holds down to the fabric. A lot of your template plastic just slips. So this is a nice thing about this. You get the straight grain lined up, and this tailor's chalk has a nice sharp edge, and you just very nicely run it along the edge of this. And then I would cut that out and fix the bottom as well. And then you can just turn this way, line it up. This is again along the straight or lengthwise grain of the fabric, and draw around it, and you cut another piece, and you can cut right along that line. You don't have to separate them at all. They can just be right next to each other. Now I wanted to tell you, people want to know about how do you sharpen these. Well, I've always used like a pair of old scissors like this. Often, you know, once it's not dull now because this is a brand new piece, but you could just kind of shave it the way you would hone a knife down. But it does get a little messy because that dust goes all over the place, so I kind of do it over a wastebasket. But we've recently discovered this Dritz sharpener for chalk, and you can just run this along this little sharpener. The dust gets in the bottom, and you can later bang it outside or something to get rid of it. But it's a perfect way to sharpen your tailor's chalk. So you've got 3 sharp sides, and when they start to get dull, you just keep going. Then you just cut these out 2 at a time, and that automatically gives you the reverse and the non-reverse, the regular and the reverse side of the templates. So you're going to need 6 regular, 6 reverse. From template F, your lightest colored, or your lightest colored fabric, and the next lightest color, you will cut 6 and 6 reverse from template E, ER. So I'm going to cut those out, and we'll be back, and I'll show you about marking your dots for sewing and sewing those together. So the question is, how do you cut these out? I'm actually old school because I started quilting before there was ever rotary cutting and rulers and all this fancy stuff. So I'm happy with my favorite scissors of all time, which are these Clover Heavy Duty. They look like humongous, but they cut beautifully. And so what I would do is just cut these 2 at a time. Because we started with this fabric already folded, it's kind of like it's married to each other. It's not going to slip on you. So I just, let me just cut over here, and I'll see how nice and smooth that is. So I just cut right up the line. I love these scissors. I will never be without them. And then I will turn and go the other way. Now, a lot of you, I mean, actually I have to say, growing up, my kids wouldn't let me have a rotary cutter because they thought I would cut my fingers off because they knew how clumsy I was. I'm known as the clumsy one. But I have, in later years, kind of learned a little bit about rotary cutting, and it's pretty cool. But I still love my scissors and use them, never am without them. But let's just talk about if these are, it's a nice long straight seam, so you could just put your ruler down, which brings me to my next favorite product I've discovered since the last videos we did, and that's this Quilter Select rulers. They have rulers of all different sizes. We carry them as well. The cool thing about this ruler, you know when you get a long cut like this, you're cutting along and you have to kind of inch your hand along to get it, because when you get to the far end, the ruler kind of slips off to one side. Well, the nice thing about this ruler, well, this is what happens. If we had the smooth side of this ruler down and I'm going along, it's just very easy for it to slide. But if you turn the ruler this way, you see how it's even kind of hard to pull. You have to almost lift it up to get it right into position. And you just position your hand at one point. Then I would go over here, line this ruler up here, and because it has that grip, it's just very easy just to take and... So whether you want to use your scissors or whether you want to use the rotary cutter, it's up to you. I don't care, just be careful. I use this rotary cutter because I still listen to my kids because they knew I was going to cut my finger off someday. I like it because after you just press the button and you cut, and then when you let go, it just comes back into place, so you're not going to run the risk. If you drop it, it's not going to cut your toe. And then it has a little lock when you're done, and you can't even move it that way. So whichever way you want to cut the pieces, you can either cut them with a rotary cutter, the way I showed you just then, or you can use your great scissors. You just need to cut 6 and 6 reverse out of the light from the F template, and 6 and 6 reverse out of the slightly darker one from your E template. And then I will show you how you're going to line them up for sewing. Now I've got a reverse and a regular piece that I've just cut out. They're together, so you want to separate those so you don't get them confused. So I'm going to move the top ones. Those two are going to go together, and these two bottom ones are going together. So let me just move them aside. Now, these are odd angles. This is going to have to go like this and like this to fit together, and you need to know exactly where to line them up. You'll notice that the templates have dots on them, and those dots are the places where they will join to the next adjacent piece. So you can see if I put these pieces together and I match the dots, those dots come right on top of each other. So those dots have to be lined up when you sew together. So you need to know how to transfer those dots to your fabric. So we need to have a hole in the template in order to get the dot. Now there's different ways to get the hole. I have this tool which is called a perfect piecer, which I use for a lot of it, but the problem is, you see this perfect piecer has the common angles we use in patchwork, but you'll notice that 60 degree, or not, the 45 degree doesn't quite match up. The 60 degree is pretty close, but it doesn't match up. So this tool, though it works for most of our common shapes that we're using, it's not going to work on these two pieces. So we need to get the holes in the template plastic a little different way. One of the ways is to have a 1/16 inch hole punch. And that's very easy. You just line that up right over the hole, you punch it, and it'll punch a hole right in there for you. Not all of you have a 1/16 inch hole punch, or maybe you don't want to buy one for this small purpose. Here's something you can do with items that you have at home. You have a hot pad. This is a tile plate. I'm not going to do this on my nice rotary cutting mat, or I would ruin it. So if you're like me, you'll have an occasional cork laying around. And this is a tapestry needle that I have stuck into the end of the cork with the eye end sticking out. Now, I will say on normal plastic, that is a lot of plastic that's used for templates, this works super quick. But on our template film, because it's heat resistant and allows you to put through a laser printer, which is quite hot, takes a little bit of extra time. So let me do this dot. What you do is you get some matches. And you get that nice and hot. You just burn it till it gets really, really hot. And then you put that right on the template film and move it around. And if you got it hot enough, it will finally burn a hole through this template film. As I say, it's yeah, there's a hole right through there. In order to get the dots marked on the back side, on the reverse side of the fabric, you don't want to mark the front side, but we want to mark, I put the template right on top of the piece that I cut, and I'm using this chalk marker. It's a sew line marker. I like it because it has, you can twist it and you get either white, pink, or lead color, and I'm going to use lead color on this really light fabric. And once this is positioned, then you've got the dots there, and you just transfer those dots, just twist your piece to the fabric, and then take the next template and do the same thing on this one. Line it up exactly, and then just go through those holes that I've already now pre-punched. And then we're going to get ready to sew those together. In addition to the dots that you're going to need for matching up the corners and the angles when you're sewing, if you're going to be hand piecing and you've never done hand piecing before, I would advise you to also mark the sewing line. Now this is where on these long pieces where I like this Quilter Select ruler here again, because this is the smaller version of it. The one side has that frosty look on it, the frosty side, and I can line that 1/4 inch from the ruler, the 1/4 inch mark, right along there, and then take the tailor's chalk. And this is where I would use the tailor's chalk. Now I use the chalk pencil for the dots, but look what happens if I try to draw a long line. Do you see how the fabric kind of drags? And that's what I like about using the tailor's chalk here, and the ruler is gripping the fabric so it doesn't slip, and you just get that nice smooth line, and it gives you a line to follow when you're sewing those together. And then you can mark, you don't need to mark both sides because we've cut the exact 1/4 inch on here, so all you now need to do is line up these two pieces here. We'll pin at the dot first. I'm going to go through the dot on one side and find it on the other. Bring that pin together. And you would do this whether you're sewing by hand or by machine, because you need to have those dots lined up perfectly. And then I will come down here to this next dot. I'm going to go through the dot. Make sure that I go through the dot on this side. So you can see the importance. You've got these odd angles sticking out, and you can trim those angles later once this is done, but I wouldn't get too hasty to trim them in case you trimmed them too much. Okay, so I've got those lined up, and you're just gonna make sure that all the way through. I'm gonna stick a couple more pins. Since that's such a long piece. Now, my book, Quilt Making by Hand, has been out of print for over a year, and fortunately we've just gotten it back in again. So it's been reprinted, and it has a lot of information on hand piecing and hand quilting. And if you've never done any of it and you decide you'd like the idea of doing it, I would urge you to go ahead and get that book now that we have it back in stock. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about the tools that we're going to use for hand sewing. It's different than machine sewing. I like the Aurifil thread. The gray spool bottom is a 28 weight, and that's the one I use for hand piecing. The orange spool, which you'll see when we get to doing some machine sewing, is 50 weight, and that's the best weight to use when you're sewing by the sewing machine. So for this project, I would say in all colorways, I would probably use 2 threads for hand piecing. I would use a black when I'm doing the really dark pieces, because there's always some black in the fabric, little dots and parts of it, an outline or whatever, and it'll just look like another part of the stitch. But when you get to really light colored fabrics like these, that black stitch will show up. So that's when I use not a super light, but a kind of a taupey, grayish kind of color. And that's what I use. So those are the 2 threads that I would use. My favorite needle that I love is the either John James or Super Glide. They're the same needle, just packaged differently. Size 11, the quilter's between size 11. I wear a thimble on my hand. I have my little trash bucket, which I carry with me everywhere. It folds up and goes back in your bag. You can hold your ruler. There's the emery board for when I have to sharpen that tailor's chalk, except I now found that sharpener. I keep a little needle minder there to hold my needles. If I'm going to be on the airplane, I'll tie my thread on here so it doesn't go falling off the bag or rolling off the tray. So that's my little waste basket that I use, and my threads. Not a whole lot of tools that I need for the hand sewing. Now, I'm going to start sewing this, and I will show you my little stitch. And I'm doing this, I know a lot of you have seen my videos and seen my hand piecing, but there's many of you probably seeing this for the first time. So I wanted to show you just a couple of the basics. Now, I've got my needle here. I'm going to, my little scissors are in here. When I cut the thread to thread the needle, because people think these eyes are super tiny, you cut it at an angle with a sharp pair of scissors. And you moisten it just a little. Now, the end of the thread that goes through the needle is the one that I hold on to and bring all the way down and use as my knot. And that way you get the nap of the thread running in the right direction. So I'm going to do my little knot, which I wrap it around my finger like this and hold it. So I've got a loop around my finger, and then with my thumb, I'm twisting it off. Then reach above the twist, pull it down, and then I got the knot. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to start right at the dot. I'm going to start down at this end. It just gives a little reinforcement. There's not going to be any set-in seam there, so you don't have to worry about it. Let me show you my little running stitch. My left hand is going up and down like this. And my index finger of my right hand is acting kind of like little feeder dogs, and it's gathering the fabric onto the needle. And I'm holding with a certain amount of tension. You see, in between, if you hold it softly like this and try sewing, you're going to have a crooked seam because it's not going in a nice straight line. So you need to have a little bit of tension for that sewing. Let me pull this up and I'll start again and show you. Then every time I go down, I usually put 3, 4, 5 stitches on my needle at a time. Every time I go down, I take what I call a back stitch, which is meaning I go a little behind where the thread came out. That's called a back stitch. And then I come up, my hand goes down, my left hand goes down, the needle comes up. I come up and then I gather with my right index finger. Down, up with my left, gather. You see how that is, that down, that gathering motion, and I get enough on there. The book tells you, gives you some guidelines and some photos, but I think seeing it on the video and watching it over and over is probably the best way. Now what happens is, it's how you're holding the needle. Some people are used to holding their needle like this and pushing with the tip of their needle. Well, so you can't do this gathering motion that I do that way. And I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way to hand stitch. It's whatever's comfortable for you and what you like and what works. But for me, this works pretty well because you can, just if you see, you can get going pretty fast and get several stitches on your needle at a time. Now, because of that little gathering I do, I periodically go back, smooth out the gathers, and then continue sewing, taking that little back stitch, and then just continue on down. Now I'm going to finish this line of sewing, and then I'm going to show you something that I'm doing differently from the last time I showed you these videos, and that's in how I press the pieces. So while I'm sewing this seam, I thought I would just mention a little bit more about this needle and why I like the 11. For one thing, a size 11 needle being thinner, but yet these John James are really nice and sturdy, they glide through the fabric a lot easier than a thicker needle. So you move up to the 10 because you think the 11 is too small, and it's just going to be harder to get the stitches through because the needle is thicker. And it's also going to be slightly bigger stitches because of that thickness as well. I like the Golden Glide or the Super Glide, depending on which packaging the needle comes in. Same needle, just different packaging. Because it also has a special coating on it that allows it to glide through the fabric more easily. So I finished sewing this seam, and one nice thing about hand sewing is that you can carry it with you and take it. I sew on the airplane. If I'm traveling, I sew in the hotel room. So you don't always have access to an iron. And I often will do what I call, well, either finger pressing, or the first thing you want to do is set the seam. So I'll take a hard surface and a pen or something like this, and I'll just move it along the seam to set the seam like that. And then I'll open it out and do the same thing. Pressing, in this case, and you wouldn't think it'd make a difference, but I would press to the dark because you always want to press towards the dark side, dark fabric, so it doesn't show through. And I would do that same kind of pressing with a nice rounded pen like this. But I'll tell you, if I'm home in my house and doing sewing, or if I have a stack of all the same thing, I'll sew all those together. I discovered this new mat. I don't know if you've seen these wool mats. They're about a ½ inch, I think they're ½ inch thick, heavy wool felted mats for pressing, and it's fabulous. I now try to do all of my stuff with that, and I know there's a controversy whether you use steam or not, but I do like a little bit of steam just for setting that seam. It smooths out the gathers that I have. Another thing this mat is great for is if you're a knitter. Oh, I did a knitted project recently, and I loved the way the final knitted garment looked. So that just gets rid of all those little the puckers from the gathering that I did with my hand stitching. And now I'm going to open this out to go towards the dark one. You'll already have some of the moistness from that steam from setting the seam, and then just press that seam. It just gives such a smooth, even look that this is now my new most favorite best friend tool. I don't use a lot of different tools for quilting, but when you do find something you like, this works really well. So hope you give that a try. Now, so to finish up on this clue, this is what we're doing. We're doing 6 like this. I've got 4 here now that I've already finished of they're all one direction, and then you'll do 6 that are the reverse, and that's when you'll come back next time with those already finished. So it's not a whole lot of work. You should be able to get this done in just a short amount of time, and we'll see you next month. Watch for that May newsletter that will come out the first Saturday in May, and have fun stitching.